Hello everyone. Today I'm going to dive into what I think are some of the most important things to understand about people pleasing. I've talked about this several times on my page, but it's so prevalent that it's worth speaking about again and again and again. So people pleasing or pleasers, it's a primary aspect of the personality. It's a relational adaptation. So it's basically a symptom, somebody who has a really strong people pleaser that they feel very identified with, that they have a really hard time separating from. This is somebody who undoubtedly grew up in a dysfunctional family home. And this relational strategy of this pleaser is trying to avoid conflict at all costs, trying to tiptoe around and make sure that everything is okay, because for the people pleaser, relational rupture is the number one biggest unsafety, right? It doesn't matter from the pleaser's perspective. It doesn't matter that you have to cut off from a bunch of other aspects of yourself, because the priority is on relational security and belonging. But there's a lot of layers to this, because people who feel like that this is their primary self or one of the primary selves, they end up feeling very used in their relationships, and they end up feeling very alone. And the people around them have no fucking idea who they really are. So part of the reason why pleasers feel so alone is because they are. When you are not honest with people about who you are, if you don't advocate for your own best interest, nobody can advocate for your best interest either. Nobody can actually know who you are and what's true for you. So the people pleaser kind of goes along with, we'll say, like the codependent relational adaptation to a dysfunctional family system, becomes like the feeder fish. The narcissist becomes the shark, the codependent becomes the feeder fish. But there's a common misunderstanding, and I think I spoke about this before in my last video. There's a misunderstanding that codependents or people pleasers are actually abandoning their own best interest or their own needs for that other person's best interest needs. But that's not actually possible, right? It's a prioritization of what's more important. So the primary need is actually the relational security and safety, making sure everything's copacetic. That's a need that the people pleaser, and that the person who has that people pleaser as a primary personality, that's a real need. That need is actually getting ranked above any other needs that that person has. So it's not possible for you to actually turn against your own best interest. It's very part of your best interest to please that person, right? But it's also not a part of your best interest, because in doing so, you are quite literally having to cut off from aspects of yourself. So here is why it is so frustrating to be in a relationship with a people pleaser. You will never actually know where you stand with them. They will say one thing to your face, and then behind closed doors, they will say something completely different to somebody else. They're very two-faced, because they can't actually get into a space within themselves where they feel safe enough to be able to be honest about how they actually feel. So they feel like there's an immense amount of pressure on them, but they also feel very disconnected from themselves. People pleasers, people with this primary aspect of their personality, are very disconnected from their own needs. They may even say, I don't know. I don't know what I want. I don't know what I need. I don't know what I feel. But that people pleaser has become so chronically immersed within the system that it's actually gaslighting all the other parts of the system. So I'll talk to people that this is very strong in them, and I'll say, well, what do you really want? What do you really need in this moment? How do you actually feel? And even though they actually know, there is that aspect that will cut them off from that knowing, and they'll say, I don't know, right? Because what they learned is that having a definition and a sense of self was dangerous. That was not going to allow that person to survive in a dysfunctional family system where everyone's out for themselves, and you absolutely have to cut off from aspects of yourself to socially survive. But these people are addicted to being good. And this is also what can make it so frustrating. I have so much empathy and so much compassion for pleasers. And I have also worked through this part of myself. It's not as strong as I think maybe in other people, but I noticed it a lot in my really intimate relationships several years ago, where I would like laugh during conflict, or I would do kind of deflecting tactics because I was terrified of upsetting somebody. I even had a situation the other day where I was so desperate for connection that when I was able to get that connection, the person that I was with, I felt like there was a mismatch. I felt like there wasn't a flow in the conversation. And normally, if I had been in a more resourced place, I would have just voiced that I felt like there was a disconnect. But that's a perfect example, right? Because people who chronically people please, like that was a slip up for me. And I was very aware and conscious in the moment that I was actually not speaking my truth, because the need for connection in that moment was more important than me pointing out the disconnect, because I was like, I literally just need connection right now. So even if it wasn't the deepest connection, I was still willing to take it. That's a really good example of kind of what goes on unconsciously within people pleasers. They're in this state of lack. They're in this state of needing that connection so badly, not even realizing it, that they're willing to put up with incompatibilities. They're willing to not advocate for themselves just so that they can get that crumb, right? So the more self-esteem that a person builds up, the less that core self-concept is based on shame, the more that a person feels like advocating for those needs and who and what they are is not going to be a detriment to relationships, but actually their greatest chance at actually having connection. So when we're operating from the people pleaser, it's very selfish, actually. It doesn't allow people to get to know us for who we actually are. It's a guarantee that we're going to continue to waste our time with people that are not compatible. And because we're not actually advertising ourselves accurately, we're missing the opportunity to call in people who actually align with who we are. And another really important thing to mention is that when you start to shift out of the people pleaser, the thing that you will experience is exactly what the people pleaser is the most terrified of experiencing. But we have to accept that when you start to change your tone and you stop pleasing and you start to listen to what you actually want and need and advocate for that, it's going to be very confusing to the people in your life, because you've advertised yourself as a completely different person than who you actually are. They're going to be confused because they're not actually in relationship with you. They're in relationship with the image of you that you gave them. So be prepared for people to be confused. Be prepared for people to be upset, which is the pleaser's absolute worst fucking nightmare. And it has to be our job in that moment to take care of the panic or the anxiety, to notice the compulsion or the impulse to fix it, to change it, to make everything better, We have to be willing to sit with those uncomfortable feelings of shame, of panic, of anxiety, right? In order to actually get closer to real intimacy and connection. And we have to accept that people are going to feel duped. And they have a right to feel duped, because that's what happened. And this is really what ends up happening in a lot of relationships, romantic relationships, where somebody will present themselves, the best version of themselves, right? That's why they say it takes about 5 or 6 months to get to know somebody, because usually by that point, if there's been any primary selves that have tried to keep the person seeing them in a certain light, the other parts are going to start to flush up. So you can only keep that up for so long. And to be honest, like, you have to reach a point where you're willing to experience upsetting other people to get closer to living a life that actually feels good for you. All right, guys. Love you. Hope you're well.